So let's start now checking the most aggressive moves, which are e5 and knight c3. Of course, in general, knight c3 very often white ends up playing e5, and we get this structure, which is of course quite dangerous for black because of the bishop on c8. This is the main problem of the French defense. In general, I would say that after e4 and other openings, also in closed openings after d4, black's main problem is that since he's lacking a tempi compared to white, that it's very difficult to develop the bishops. So it's difficult to manage the opening in such way that both bishops will get out and get into active positions. So here, French defense, of course, the move e6 is logical because you're fighting for the center, followed by d5, and then you develop pieces quickly, ready to castle in general. But this bishop on c8 is always an issue to solve for black. And of course, if white is playing e5 sooner or later, then that becomes a main strategical aspect of the position. If black manages to exchange it one day or activate it, then probably he will be doing okay. Well, there are certain circumstances, of course, if he loses too much time doing it. Also, it can be not that simple. But in general, of course, it's pretty much the main problem of black's position once white is playing e5. So let's start with the third e5. It is a dangerous move. It is a very principled move, but I always had a feeling, and I still believe that here black has, in general, quite a number of options, which gives him a decent play. I mean, white, his position is always a little bit strategically dangerous, but then that's what you have playing e6, yeah. But otherwise, in general, black has some counterplay, and quite often the positions which arise after the third e5 are very complicated and double-edged. I mean, black definitely has his winning chances after this move. Also, from the white side, the advantage compared to knight c3 variations that there is a bit less theory. I mean, there are less possible pawn structures and less direct, lines to study and to analyze. But again, I still believe that knight c3 is the best move and is the most difficult move to face for black. But so let's investigate e5, c5, of course, c3. So now you see, of course, white gets a certain space advantage, which is always nice. That's always very important asset in strategy of chess. But the drawback of this is this eternally weak d4 pawn. Yeah, so black's play is most of the time here is based on attacking this pawn or trying to stop white from getting a comfortable development, because he has to take care of the d4 pawn all the time. So it's pretty much about it. What is good here, for black, that black has quite a number of actually playable options. So most of the lines in theory here are not that clear, even though, of course, I wouldn't say that I know some very clear, direct way to equalize or to get a very comfortable game for black. But I'm sure I will show you major options which black has, and you can probably choose something to your liking. It's actually quite nice playing black, and that that in a certain opening, variation, you have a choice. You have quite a wide choice of playable options. So knight c6, it's a most logical move, but actually there is a system, queen b6. You can start with queen b6, white must play knight f3, and now bishop d7. So as I mentioned already, it's very direct, straightforward way to try to change those bishops. So you want to play bishop b5 next, and then only knight c6. It's not very popular, this system, for some reason. Frankly, I don't actually know why, because according to the state of theory, there is no clear way for white to get an advantage here. So I can, if you don't want to study too many lines, I mean, this one is quite direct, and you can analyze it, and maybe it's perfectly playable. So the idea is that now white has to play a3 or bishop e2 probably, because if he's doing something, let's say trying to stop bishop b5 with a4, then you can already get your knight c6, and basically you will be a tempi up. Yeah, or CD first, knight c6 or knight c6, and you will just get an extra tempi in this position. Yeah, and a4 is not a great move. So one of the ideas is to play a3 here. Very typical for this variation. White wants to play b4, but then bishop b5. I also have seen Black playing a5 here, a little strange, but maybe perfectly playable also. But bishop b5, and now the main point is for white to try to play c4. So that is a way white is trying to treat this position very often. Yeah, because bishop d7, bishop b5, the both knights are on b8, on g8, so black is lacking development a bit. So that makes quite some sense, but actually here probably it's not that dangerous, because after bishop c4 takes, and now the important point is that after d5, that is white's idea, then black has immediately, or one or two moves later, probably right here, queen b3 move, and which forces white to change queens, and black is having a good game here. I think it's enough for black to equalize. So that's why maybe white's best is bishop e2, bishop b5. That's the point of the, and now c4, or let's say takes on b5, takes, and maybe a4. This is an interesting way of playing for white. So you can get it obviously also via a3, bishop b5, take on b5 and a4. And then with the idea that if black is trying to play queen a6 just to stop white from castling, then probably white can take on c5, and if bishop takes c5, he has b4, b5, and so on. So probably after a4, maybe black has to retreat to d7, white castles, knight c6. Frankly, it looks perfectly playable for black, this position. But maybe again, d takes c5, b4 ideas. I mean, white has a certain development advantage, so maybe things are not so simple for black, but it might be perfectly playable. And otherwise c4 here, that is the very direct way to to refute this system. But I don't know, I looked at human games, computer games, doesn't seem to be clear this position. So now if bishop takes c4, white takes and plays d5. Here with a pawn on a2, it might be quite dangerous for black. But now already dc4 is the main move. Here, of course, in this position, white would definitely prefer to have the pawn on a3. It would be a very useful move. But anyways, white is trying to play d5, and it's a very, very complicated, sharp position, which you need to analyze. If you find it okay for black, then the whole system is perfectly playable, in my opinion. But anyways, knight c6 is the most logical, knight f3, and now black has two major strategical ideas how to proceed in this variation. Just want to mention that f6. I have to be careful with this f6 in general in this type of positions with black, because sometimes it It's a very important move, yeah, than trying to fight against white's central dominance. But black has to be ready for it. Yeah, I think that with all those pieces not undeveloped, probably f6 here is premature. White is playing bishop b5 and then castles and then playing for a quick development, and I think it's not good for black. Probably very dangerous. So maybe f6 here is premature. Then knight c6, knight f3. So there are two ways to play. One is playing queen b6, so trying to put immediate pressure, on the d4 pawn, and then trying to attack it with a knight and to get the knight to f5. So maybe a bit more direct way of playing, but it's also perfectly reasonable to play bishop d7. Bishop d7, a useful move, and because it's not easy for white to develop actually in this position. For instance, if he's playing a3 here, then already c4 is perfectly playable. Let's say knight bd2, knight a5. And actually, this is a strange, complicated strategically position, but you will see that black is basically having an extra tempi compared to one of the lines in the queen b6 system, because he will get his queen to c7, and I think he's doing quite okay, even though you have, of course, to understand, to study this position, how to play it. I think black very often tries to get this maneuver knight to b6 and then bishop a4, knight a4. Has to be careful about white organizing his play on the king side, but all in all, it's perfectly playable for black and is probably fine here. Then bishop d3, of course, is the most logical and active way to develop the pieces, but then after takes queen b6, white starts to have real problems just defending the pawn on d4. So he can castle. There is a line like this. Sometimes white castles, just sacrificing this pawn, let's say, takes queen e2 or something, but here it's probably not enough. White has some play, but objectively black is at least equal, probably better objectively, but you need to study a bit this line also if you're playing black, this variation. Otherwise, bishop e2, what else? So you develop bishop, but of course bishop on e2 is less active than on d3, but from other point of view, your pawn on d4 is protected here. So let's say knight g7. Okay, black has a big amount of possible options. Even he can already here try to play f6. It's another possible variation, but I'm trying to show you what considers to be the best in theory, and knight e7 seems to be the best move, and this is the idea for black. So he's not trying to attack the d4 pawn very quickly, but just trying to develop and maybe to push f6. So white castles, and I would recommend you here. There is no clear way path to equality for black in this variation. So again, if black tries to put pressure on the d4 pawn, then maybe I would advise you to play queen b6 already. So let's say knight f5 is a very reasonable move, of course, trying to attack the pawn, and black wants to take on d4 and then followed by queen b6. But here dc5 is very unpleasant. Bishop takes c5, then let's say starting with knight bd2, followed by bishop d3. Yeah, this structure, I think knight on f5 is a bit misplaced. And in general, this structure, when white has the pawn on e5 and is able to protect it, it's strategically pretty dangerous for black, because then he can, unless he can manage to attack quickly the pawn on e5 or push f6 under, good circumstances, then if white manages bishop d3, rook e1, knight b3, bishop f4, then usually it can end up in a direct attack on the king side, because black king will probably land on g8. So you have to be careful about this type of positions with black. Might be pretty dangerous. So let's say queen c7, the theory goes knight b3, bishop d6, bishop d3. So black is not in time to take the pawn on e5. Knight f7, for instance, rook e1, knight g6, queen e2. So you see white is just in time to protect the pawn on e5, and this position is, I would be very worried to play it with black. I don't say it's bad, but it's quite dangerous in my opinion. Well, there are some other ideas. Sometimes black is trying to play like knight h4, trying to change one pair of knights, but still sooner or later it gets to the same position. White is taken on h4, knight f3, bishop d3, rook e1 or queen e2, bishop f4. Well, not easy for black to equalize, at least. Then another way to play is takes on knight f5, but that gives white a very important square. And now he can play knight c3 already. And it's important that after queen b6, white has knight a4. So black is just not in time to take the pawn on d4. So knight a4, queen a5, bishop d2, queen d8, and now bishop c3 or bishop f4. I don't know, even bishop c3. And okay, the knight on a4 is, it's a bit strange piece. Probably black will play sooner or later b6 just to stop at some point knight c5. But this knight will get back into the game, and what is the most important, that white has a full control on the pawn on d4, and black lost quite a number of tempes with his queen. So that is in white's favor. Then bishop e7, that's very important, also tactical nuance, that white has bishop d3 move here. That is very important. Otherwise, probably this whole setup would be perfectly fine for black. But after bishop d3, black has quite serious problems, because white simply wants, for the moment, at this moment, to take on f5 and knight takes d5. And black is, if he takes on d4, then there is this knight takes d4, queen g4, attacking the pawn on g7, and white is better here. So that's why black is usually trying to play rook c8 here, so kind of semi-waiting move. And this is a big theoretical position where white has many, many different moves, possible moves, even like king h1. Quite a big theory, but all in all, not easy for black here. I think that it's playable, but probably it's not fully equalizing. That's why if you already choose to play bishop d7, maybe what is interesting, I can advise you to have a look at this line where black just trying to play knight g6, and then pretty often he's even trying to get to this type of position, let's say bishop e3, because now dc, of course, is not working so well already, and pawn on a5 is weak. And then after bishop e3, even, something like that, cd, cdf6, if it were ef, gf, this type of position might be not so clear. Of course, black has a certain, there are some questions with black king, but from other point of view, maybe bishop d6, castle, and so on, black has a good center, and the position is not that clear. I don't know, it's whether here, whether on the next move, maybe in this position, cd, cdf6, although I would probably prefer in this structure to have my bishop on d6. So that is something to investigate, this position. So let's say you can play like this, let's say castle a3, and see, maybe at some point, sooner or later, probably black will take on d4, sooner or later, and then trying to get f6 or rook c8, f6. I'm not sure if it's fully equalizes, but it's definitely playable. So all in all, bishop d7 is a possible move. It's not as direct as queen b6, but playable. But I think that the main continuation still is queen b6, because now white actually has to know exactly what to do, in fact, just to finish his development. Because after queen b6, what are the options? Not too many. Bishop d3 leads to this position which we have analyzed. C takes d4. Quite important, not to mix up move order, because if you start with bishop d7, then white already would take and castle. That's very important, that he is in time here to castle and having a nice position. So that's why you should take here on d4. And after c takes d4, bishop d7, we are back to to this variation, to this position which we've just checked in the bishop d7 line. So the pawn is hanging, you can try to sacrifice it with the castle, or if you're trying to play bishop c2 to protect it in this way, then black has, among other ideas, simply knight b4. And white probably will have to give up this bishop for the knight, because after, let's say, bishop b3, yeah, he can have a problem after bishop b5. So all in all, bishop d3 is not not dangerous. Bishop e2 is an interesting move, but now things are getting very direct. Yeah, I mean, the main problem of bishop e2 is that after cd4, black has a knight h6 move, which is making things very, very direct, and it's simply not easy because he made an tempi economy on bishop d7 move, so it makes it quite difficult for white simply to protect this d4 pawn. Why on h6? Because if you start with knight e7, it gives white an option to play knight a3 here, and after knight f5 to play knight c2. At least now white has the center under control. His knight on c2 is not extremely active, but anyways, the pawn on d4 is protected. And usually, there is quite a big theory in this position. Black is playing bishop d7, castles, rook c8. And here again, huge theory, very complicated position. I wouldn't say that white necessarily having an advantage here, because black very often, before developing and castling, because he needs to take care of g4 ideas all the time. So what black is usually doing here is trying to play knight a5 or knight b4, bishop b5, because even having the bishop on f8 very often, because the idea is that once white is playing g4, that he wants to have the e7 square, and then maybe trying to counter this with h5 at some point. Anyways, it's playable position for black, but not so direct as knight h6, because now the idea is that knight a3, black can already take on a3 and play knight f5. Of course, in general, it's better not to give up this black square bishop, but here it's simply very direct. Yeah, there is a problem with the d4 pawn. So after knight h6, white has basically, in my opinion, only one option really to try something, which is, very tricky one, is sacrificing a pawn, playing bishop takes h6 and queen takes b2. Yeah, those positions after gh, queen d2 are probably in white's favor because of the compromised pawn structure, even though black has some ideas, let's say playing bishop g7 and at some point castling f6, but practice has shown that it's not enough to get a good position. I mean, this pawn structure is just too bad. But queen takes b2 is possible, and now the queen is not getting trapped. If white retreats with his bishop, somewhere to e3 or d2, black can just take the rook, and the queen is not getting trapped. So white's probably best is to play something like knight d2, gh, and castle here. And it's a very, very unclear position. White has certain compensation for one pawn. Black can try to take the second pawn, or just trying to play more like quietly, just developing pieces. Of course, his king is in the center, but he has two bishops, and I believe it must be fine for black in general, but you need to study this position. Yeah, by the way, I want to mention that so there are a lot of nuances with move orders. Yeah, you need to really know well, because if black starts with knight h6 here, then already bishop takes h6 is working well, because queen takes b2 actually is simply bad here, because bishop retreats and then the queen is actually getting trapped here, I think even in more than one way. So this is not playable for black. Believe me, you don't have to even check it with a machine. It's quite well known. It's checked already. That because after at some point black takes here, because white is playing queen c2, queen b3, or queen b3, and after cd he can always take with a piece, and it makes this queen, it's actually makes it impossible to get out with the queen. So that's why knight h6 is not accurate. And again, if gh, queen d2, then we are getting to this type of position, which is in this particular situation, which is in white's favor. So that's why if bishop e2, cd, and knight e7 again is playable if you don't want some forced lines, and but knight h6 is the most challenging. So now, if white doesn't want to sacrifice a pawn and play this tricky and very risky position where white can easily lose, also then he can play knight c3, and this is the old theory. After knight f5, now things are becoming very direct. So knight a4, queen a5 check. Well, the only problem, if it's a problem, that if white simply repeats move with knight c3, probably it's difficult to find anything better than just playing queen b6, because otherwise white would castle and probably just be better. So white can make a draw here, but again, you are playing black, and normally it's your opponent doesn't want to make a quick draw. And otherwise, if white is playing for advantage with a bishop d2 move, here black is perfectly fine. So he's playing bishop b4, a very direct play, because the pawn on d4 simply is hanging. So bishop c3. Now more than one way for black to be fine. The simplest is b5, a3. Okay, white is lucky to save material here with this move, but now you take on c3, knight takes c3, b4. Again, very direct play, ab, queen b4. Again, there is an issue with the d4 pawn, b2 pawn. So queen a4 is usually played here, bishop d7, then white is changing queens. And black is perfectly fine in this endgame because his king is on the center and open files, c and b line. Black is at least equal here. Well, not more than equal, but no problems. And the d4 pawn is still quite weak. So that's about bishop e2 move. That's why by far the main move here is a3. Not because white wants so much, to play this move before developing his piece. It's just because it's one of the very few ways to keep control on the d4 square, on the d4 pawn. And here again, black has a wide choice of different systems. Some of them are a bit dubious in my opinion, like for instance f6. It's very direct, but again, it's probably a bit dubious. I believe that white is objectively better here, even though the position is extremely complicated. Usually white is playing bishop d3, fe, de, c4, because sooner or later, otherwise white will castle maybe next, otherwise white will play c4 on his own very often, or b4, and that would be even worse for black. So that's why black plays c4, bishop c2. So now at least he's having the pressure on the b2 pawn. But all in all, then what black is trying to do sometimes is to attack the e5 pawn, but white is in time to castle, rook e1. He has in his pocket the idea to play b3 or b4 at some point. You can check games here. It's not very, it's pretty complicated, but probably it's better for white in my opinion. So that is why f6 I personally consider a bit dubious. There is a very positional way of playing here, very safe, at least in a short term, which is to play c4. So of course, normally with a pawn on a2, normally it's not a good move, obviously, in this opening, in this variation, because black usually tries to put a lot of pressure on the d4 pawn. But here it's just justified because of a3 was played and white weakened, squares on the king side like this. Knight d2, knight a5, followed by bishop d7. White is not in time a bit to push b4, b3, because black has c takes b3, and very often after knight takes b3 he has bishop a4 idea, for instance, this pin. And then, yeah, black is just trying to play a very slow game. Rook b1 immediately here or later. So black anyway is playing his bishop d7, knight e7. Quite often knight, as I've mentioned already, is going via e7 to c8, queen goes to c7, knight b6. Yeah, this knight on d2, the white's problem is that, his bishop on c1 is stuck. Very difficult to move somewhere the knight on d2 because knight b3 comes very quickly. So I think its system is very playable. If you like a strategical, game, very slow strategical game, of course you need to study it to see games of strong players. But I'm not sure if white having anything special in this variation. But it's a matter of liking, of course. If you want something more direct, more straightforward, or a bit more tactical, then c4 is not for you. But otherwise, I believe it's a very playable system actually. But normally black is trying to to put pressure on the d4 pawn. Again, the same story. I have to be careful. For instance, knight e7 here is a mistake because white can take on c5 and black cannot take back with a bishop. So that is that would be not an option. That is not an option. Then so what are the options? C takes d4 is also not great here because takes. You see the difference compared to bishop e2 that here, for instance, knight e7 or knight h6. Now white has knight c3, and after knight f5, first of all, there is knight a4 possible, but actually simple bishop e3 is quite good because black cannot, you see very useful move a3. Black cannot take on b2 because his queen is getting trapped. And so finally black sort of failed with his counterplay on the d4 pawn. So let's say bishop e7, bishop d3, knight takes e3, f takes e3, and for example, that is very dangerous for black, this type of position. In general, it's fine if you haven't played queen b6 too early or under some circumstances. Here, it's pretty dangerous. So at least it considers to be, quite a dubious line for black. So what are the normal lines, on top of this c4, which I've mentioned? Bishop d7 is also a possible move. b4, well, that's an idea also, another idea of why when white is playing a3, b4, because just to clarify the situation on the queen side, and after cd, now white has a c3 square for his knight. Yes, so he wants to play knight c3, maybe followed by knight a4, and the idea is just to, so to say, to prove that the black's queen on b6, is doing nothing there. So like black lost a couple of tempists, because that is true. If black doesn't manage to organize a direct play against the d4 pawn, most probably sooner or later the queen will have to retreat. So this, but still, so in this position, you need to study a lot of theory. There are many lines, very, very subtle play, and lots of tactical nuances. So, there is a mixture of tactics, strategy here. For instance, now rook c8 is an important move just to stop knight c3, because then you can take somewhere on d4 or something. The knight will be hanging. And again, the whole strategical point here is if white manages to develop normally to castle, get his knight on c3, he will be better here. But it's not easy to realize. For instance, after bishop b2, quite often black manages to stop white from developing just by tactical means. For instance, here there is a knight a5 move, which is quite a nice trick. So black wants to get with his knight to c4, and using the fact that now the bishop on b2 is hanging after ba. And for instance, knight bd2, knight c4, very sharp line which you need to study. So you see the game started, well, quite strategical battle. Now it gets very tactical. Yes, so you need to study some direct lines. For instance, like this is one of the lines. A5 looks a bit dubious for black in a way, because he doesn't have a great development. But according to theory, I think it's doing fine for black. White is playing knight d2, and anyway, lots of different lots of lines here which you better analyze with a computer and remember. But it's one of the possible ways of playing. Another most common is knight h6. Knight h6 is probably the main move in this position, and also which leads to very, very extremely complicated positions, very double-edged positions, which you need to study carefully with both colors, actually, because white can also get worse quite easily if he doesn't know exactly what he is doing. So let's say if bishop d3 now, cd, knight f5. Yeah, now white is not in time. He didn't have time to play knight c3. That's why, you remember, it's very important to play knight h6 before c takes d4, that white doesn't have the c3 square for his knight. And white is forced to take on f5. This is another very typical pawn structure in this system. And I think it's fine for black, even though, strangely enough, I checked the statistics of computer battles between each other, and it was in white's favor. But yeah, finally, I mean, first of all, computers nowadays, engines are assessing it as equal, and I also don't see why white has any advantage, because black is extremely solid, and so normally the game develops something, in this way, like white is playing b4, bishop e7, both sides castles, then rook fc8. Of course, the only important point is that if knight a4, then probably you can have queen b5, maybe even queen d8 is okay, or queen b5. It's just important to make sure that that white doesn't manage to exchange this black square bishop, then he will be better, yeah? So sometimes you need to play h6 in those positions to stop it. But otherwise, yeah, I mean, black has a c line, potential play on the c line, c4 square. I don't see why, for instance, queen d3, rook fc8, don't see why white should have anything here, yeah? Because for the moment, bishop g5 you cannot do, because the d4 pawn is hanging, and once, for instance, let's say you defend the pawn, you want, more or less, sooner or later get bishop g5, then there is always h6, or even queen d8 is possible. The queen is not needed anymore on b6. I think it's just equal position. So I don't think there is any danger really for black here. That's why, bishop takes h6, already queen takes b2 is working. Yeah, here, because white lost a very important tempo on the a3 move, and he's again in this version, he's not trapping the queen. So you have to be careful playing this variation with both colors, especially with black, not to confuse, not to confuse move orders, to know exactly when you can take on b2 and when, in which situations, actually it's impossible, you're just losing your queen. But here black is fine. So that's why b4 is the main move now. C takes d4, and white has a choice of two different type of positions. Both are very unclear and complicated. For instance, bishop takes h6, you see intermediate move, because white couldn't do it a move earlier, but now he can, gh, cd4. But this is a better version compared to some which we have checked earlier, because white had somewhat weakened his pawn structure here, and lost some tempos. There are many games in this position of good players. I don't know. It's very complicated position, which can turn into white or black favor very easily. So you need to, to understand, to know this position well, to understand the main ideas. I think the main move is bishop d7 here. So black wants to play rook c8 to get quickly a play against, on the queen side. Actually, the white's problem that it's difficult again, if he would manage to develop, let's say if he manages to get his knight to b3 and just protect the pawn on d4, he would be better. But it's very difficult to manage, because if knight c3, for instance, I think black has knight takes b4 already, tactical thing, and then this pin, if ab, bishop takes b4, I think you have a real problem with the pin. That's why knight d2 is not possible, because the pawn on d4 is hanging. Same goes for bishop d3, so it's quite difficult for white to develop normally here. For instance, if bishop e2, of course, the most logical way of playing, then rook g8 is a very important move, and again, the game gets pretty direct. So one of the main theoretical lines here is castles and rook g4. So you see black is very quick attacking the pawn on d4. h3, things are getting pretty forced here. Rook f4, g3, and black can sacrifice in exchange. Rook takes f3, taking on d4 here with a queen, I think, according to theory. And for instance, something like that, bishop g7 or some other move. This considers to be fine for black. I think the position is roughly equal here. Black is okay. So that's why the main theoretical move is rook a2. Very strange, very strange move, but there is a point. So the idea is that now rook g8 is coming without a tempi, and actually white wants to have sometimes rook d2 when, just to protect the pawn on d4 if needed. So now, for instance, if rook g8 is maybe not that useful anymore, because white can simply play h3, just stopping rook g4, and it's not so clear if black needs rook on g8, because he might also need to castle. Would be not a bad idea to castle short. So usually black is playing rook c8. Now already bishop e2. I think the main idea is that now this maneuver is not so efficient anymore, this black's maneuver, because white has the rook d2 move. He can defend this pawn, and then it's hitting the air. And after bishop e2, black changes his plans. Usually he's trying to play bishop g7, and then, again, you see knight, you cannot develop the knight from b1 at the moment. And black is trying to castle, play f6, to break the center. Very complicated, sharp position, pretty unclear. And after cd, another option is very logical to play cd4, but then knight f5. And again, white has an option to protect this pawn via playing bishop b2 or bishop e3. I think both are playable, both are very complicated and unclear. Strategically quite tricky. Not quite dangerous for black, but if you know well what you are doing, you can also get better with black here. So here in this e5 variation, the knowledge and understanding, mainly understanding of the main strategical ideas, is actually very important. So the one who understands it better will probably prevail in the opening. So bishop e3, and now, for instance, if bishop e7, bishop d3, this type of position here, it's maybe a bit better version for black, because white has played b4, and actually normally he would try to play on the king side, so he doesn't really need to play b4. Well, he had to, because of the opening moves. But still, something like that, bishop d7, knight c3, still maybe not so easy for black, although probably nothing so special. There are many moves here. One of the ideas is to play f6, for instance. Okay, this is a position you need to study carefully. White has certain chances to get opening advantage, but all in all, I think that black, if he's playing correctly, must be fine. And another way, more logical, I would say, is to play bishop b2, bishop d7, actually developing an prophylactic move, because now white wants maybe just to put his bishop on d3, because you cannot take on d4 because of all exchanges, then bishop b5 check. Therefore, black plays bishop d7, so now stopping bishop d3, because now you can already take on d4 with black. And after bishop d7, the main move is g4. So white tries to, again, knight c3 doesn't work because of knight takes d4, so white is having problems developing simply his pieces. b5 also has drawbacks, because then knight a5, you start to have problems on the king side. So g4 is one of the main moves. I mean, the main move here, knight e7, knight c3. So at least now white had developed the pieces how he wanted it, but okay, also weakened a bit his king side. Black has potential ideas of h5, trying to use the early g4. Or I think the main line here is knight a5, this typical maneuver which you have seen already. It works tactically. I mean, yeah, because let's say knight a4, you have queen c6, for instance. Yeah, so very complicated position you need to analyze. Let's say knight d2 is the main line here, rook c8. So you see, it's very difficult to play all those moves. Actually, like knight d2, because the d4 pawn is somewhere hanging. Rook c8 is not an easy move to find. So I would advise you to analyze this position, carefully if you are black, and white also, because you can also get worse with white. But it's a very, very rich, very interesting position to play. And of course, white's play is logical. He's trying to get a lot of space, and it's a very principled way of playing for white. But again, I also believe that all in all, this third e5 system, I quite liked facing it, playing black, because I felt like I have my chances to win the game, and the positions are very rich. So to me, if you're playing black, a serious system to face. I mean, you have to pay attention in your preparation to know for sure to know exactly what you are doing against it. But I think that it's not going to also to make you quit playing e4 e6.